The sound of splintering wood still echoes in my mind. The morning Rick Coleman ordered the HOA crew to tear down my brand new fence while I stood on my own lawn, screaming for them to stop. It was early, maybe 7:15 a.m., when the rumble of a truck engine jolted me awake. The air smelled like wet grass and sawdust from yesterday's work. Tom was still inside making coffee when I stepped onto the porch and saw them. Four men in orange vests, tools in hand, already unlatching the gate like they owned the place. At first, I thought there had been some mistake. We'd finished the fence only 3 days earlier. A beautiful 6-foot cedar design that wrapped around the backyard. It wasn't just a fence. It was privacy, peace, and the first real project I'd done for myself since buying this house. But before I could even say a word, one of the men kicked at the bottom panel, splintering a board clean in half. The sound cut through the air, sharp, cruel, final, and then I saw him, Rick Coleman, standing at the end of my driveway with his hands on his hips, wearing that smug little smirk he reserved for the neighborhood newsletter photos. His white polo shirt was pressed so neatly it could have been ironed on his body. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," he said, pretending to be cordial. "Unfortunately, this structure doesn't meet our community standards." His tone was practiced, calm, bureaucratic, like he was reading from a rulebook. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "You can't just walk in here and start tearing it down." One of the workers paused, looking between us, uncertain. But Rick raised a clipboard and waved a set of papers in the air. "Under Section 14B of the HOA guidelines," he recited, "any unapproved exterior modification may be removed at the homeowner's expense." Cold air bit at my face. The smell of cedar mixed with diesel fumes as another board cracked and fell. "Unapproved?" I said, stepping closer. "I submitted the design. You signed off on it yourself." Rick's smile twitched but didn't break. "You must be mistaken," he said, almost enjoying the words. "No record of that approval exists." His eyes were flat, unbothered. "You'll need to remove the fence yourself within 7 days, or the association will proceed with corrective action." Corrective action. That phrase, the way he said it, felt like a threat. I could feel my fingers shaking as I grabbed for the papers, but he pulled them back just enough to make me look foolish reaching. The neighbors across the street had their curtains half drawn. I could see the glint of someone's phone camera through the window. No one stepped outside. No one said a thing. Tom finally came out, coffee mug in hand, confusion all over his face. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, but Rick didn't even acknowledge him. "You'll receive a formal notice by mail," he said, turning toward his car. "If you'd like to appeal, the board meets next Tuesday, though I wouldn't recommend it. It's an open and shut violation." His voice carried a casual cruelty, the kind that made you feel smaller, just for existing. The crew stopped once the section closest to the gate was down, then packed their tools without another word. When they left, they didn't look at me. Maybe they didn't want to see the woman whose fence they'd just destroyed. I knelt down beside the broken boards. My hands ran over the jagged edges where the wood had splintered, the smell of fresh cedar heavy in the air. I could feel my throat tightening, part rage, part disbelief. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about control, about power. Rick Coleman wanted everyone in this neighborhood to remember who ran it. Tom put a hand on my shoulder, but I couldn't look up. My voice came out quiet, raw. "He can't do this," I whispered. "He can't just come onto our property and—" "He can't," Tom said, cutting me off. "We'll figure it out." But Rick was already backing his silver truck out of the driveway, rolling down the window one last time. "7 days, Mrs. Miller," he called out. "After that, it becomes a legal matter." I stood there on the damp grass, the morning sun catching the sawdust in the air like ash. Around me, the neighborhood looked exactly the same, trimmed lawns, painted shutters, that fake suburban calm. But everything had changed. My home no longer felt like mine. As the sound of his engine faded down the street, I looked at the broken wood scattered around me and knew this wasn't about bylaws or fence heights. This was personal. Rick wanted obedience, and he'd picked the wrong homeowner to bully. Rick gives Sarah 7 days to remove it herself, or face thousands in fines. By the third letter, I stopped opening them. Every envelope reeked of control. The first one arrived only a day after the crew tore down my fence. It was printed on heavy paper with the HOA seal embossed at the top, as if that made it law. The second one came 2 days later, typed in the same cold language, with the same hollow warning. Failure to comply may result in legal action and property liens. By the third, the red stamp across the front read "Final Notice" in bold capital letters, and I didn't need to read another word to know what it said. Every morning, I'd find another envelope tucked against the edge of the mailbox, the ink slightly damp from the dew. The sound of the paper tearing open started to make my stomach turn. Inside each one was another threat. New fines, citations, even talk of community penalties if I refused to cooperate. Tom tried to keep calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw every time he read one. He'd set the letters on the counter beside his untouched coffee, shake his head and mutter, "They can't do this without proof." But that was the problem. Rick didn't need proof. He had authority, or at least he acted like he did, and everyone else followed. The days started to feel longer. The phone would ring, and I'd hesitate before answering, afraid it was another HOA representative. The nights weren't much better. I'd lie awake listening to the faint hum of cars passing by, wondering if anyone else had ever been treated like this. If anyone in this picture-perfect neighborhood had the courage to stand up to Rick Coleman. By the end of the week, neighbors who used to wave stopped making eye contact. Nancy, the woman next door who once borrowed sugar every other week, suddenly pretended not to see me when I said hello. Word was spreading. Rick made sure of it. He'd sent out a community email accusing me of defacing the neighborhood's image and refusing compliance. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a problem, a cautionary tale meant to keep everyone else in line. Tom wanted to let it go. "It's just a fence, Sarah," he said one evening, trying to sound reasonable. "We'll rebuild it lower if that keeps them quiet." But it wasn't just a fence anymore. It was my right to live without being bullied. I could feel it deep in my bones. Giving in would mean giving him permission to control everything else. When the HOA scheduled their next public meeting, I decided to go. I needed to look Rick in the eye, to remind him that I wasn't backing down. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige building that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. About 20 homeowners sat in folding chairs murmuring among themselves. Rick sat at the front table, gavel in hand, pretending to be some kind of judge. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, holding one of his letters. "Mr. Coleman," I said evenly, "you've sent 3 violations with no supporting documentation. I have the original approval request for that fence, signed and dated by your office." I laid the paper on the table. "Under state law, I have the right to request written proof of bylaw authority. Can you provide it?" Rick leaned back, smirking, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Mrs. Miller," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "this board doesn't need to justify itself to someone who refuses to cooperate with community standards. We've been more than patient." Laughter rippled through the room, quiet and uncomfortable. My face burned, but I didn't look away. "So you don't have it," I said softly. Rick's smile faltered for just a moment. That was all I needed to see. When the meeting ended, I walked toward the door, my pulse still racing. Behind me, I heard Rick's voice, lower now, his tone colder than before. "If you won't comply," he said, "we'll handle it ourselves." That sentence hung in the air like a warning shot. I turned back, met his eyes for a second, and saw it. Not irritation, not formality, but something darker. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "Rick declares, if you won't comply, we'll handle it ourselves." The truth was buried 3 drawers deep in a dusty county file cabinet. I hadn't planned on spending my Thursday morning in the county recorder's office, but after Rick's threat at the HOA meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. He'd spoken with so much confidence, as if the entire neighborhood belonged to him. But rules only hold power when they're real. And I wanted proof that his weren't. The county office sat at the edge of town. A squat brick building that smelled faintly of paper, toner, and old coffee. The woman at the reception desk, her name tag reading Jenna, looked up with the kind of polite fatigue that only comes from government work. "Can I help you?" she asked, tapping her pen against a stack of folders. "I'm looking for zoning records," I said. "Property lines, specifically for the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision." She raised an eyebrow. "HOA trouble?" she asked dryly. I gave a small, humorless laugh. "Something like that." She motioned toward the back. "Drawer system's old, but it'll tell you everything you need to know. Try cabinet C, third drawer down. That's where we keep the original plats." The air back there was cooler, quieter. I could hear the low hum of a copy machine somewhere nearby. I pulled open the metal drawer and started flipping through thick manila folders. Street by street, lot by lot. My fingertips grew dusty as I moved past decades of handwritten surveys and faded blueprints. The edges of the paper were brittle, like the ghosts of a town that used to be simpler. When I finally found Oak Ridge Estates, the folder was heavier than the others, packed with maps, signatures, and revisions. I laid the map flat on the counter and traced the familiar shape of our street with my finger. There was my lot, rectangular, just as I remembered, and there the line marking the back of our property. But then something caught my eye. A thin strip of land ran between my fence and the neighboring row of lots. A narrow band about 4 feet wide, shaded differently from the rest. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe a surveyor's mark. But next to the line was a small notation, Parcel 17B, unassigned. My pulse quickened. I turned the page, looking for more detail, and found a separate document referencing the parcel. It had been left out of the HOA's recorded jurisdiction when the developer went bankrupt 20 years ago. It was, in legal terms, a no-man's land. County property. My mind raced. That strip of ground ran exactly along the section where Rick said my fence violated HOA boundaries. But if the HOA didn't legally control that land, then his entire case, every citation, every letter, was built on a lie. I took the map to the front desk. "Jenna," I said, breathless, "this parcel here, 17B, it's unassigned?" She glanced at the paper, then at me, and gave a small nod. "Has been for years. It's technically public land, but since it's less than 5 feet wide, no one ever bothered to develop it. You'd be surprised how many of these little gaps exist between subdivisions." "So the HOA has no authority over it?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair, giving me a knowing smile. "If it's not part of their recorded plat, they don't own it. They can't enforce anything on it." "Why?" I hesitated, glancing at the map again. "Because that's where my fence sits." Her eyebrows lifted. "Well then, sounds like your HOA's been overstepping." She reached for another binder, flipping through property transaction codes. "Out of curiosity, you thinking about doing something with it?" "I don't know," I said, though my voice betrayed the thought already forming in my head. "What if someone wanted to buy it?" Jenna's eyes flicked up from the page, the corners of her mouth turning upward in a slow grin. "Technically anyone can. It's still a county-owned parcel. And between you and me, those narrow strips? They're usually cheap. Really cheap. You just have to file the paperwork." I felt something stir inside me. A spark of possibility, small but alive. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting to Rick's power. I was thinking ahead, planning. The fear that had kept me quiet began to shift into something else. Curiosity, even excitement. The dusty air didn't feel so heavy anymore. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed almost like a rhythm, a quiet anthem of defiance. I took one last look at the map before sliding it back into the folder. Rick Coleman had built his authority on intimidation, but maybe, just maybe, I'd found the one place his rules didn't reach. Jenna handed me a form across the counter. "If you're serious," she said, "fill this out and bring it back. That parcel's still available, and it won't cost you much at all." Her words hit me like a spark to dry tinder. Still available. Cheap. My pulse quickened. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Jenna tells her the parcel is still available for purchase, and cheap. Rick's grin vanished when I dropped the county map on the HOA table. The room went silent. The kind of silence that stretches and hums, heavy with tension and curiosity. The map lay there between us like a weapon, its edges still creased from the county folder, the faint scent of old paper cutting through the air freshener someone had sprayed minutes before. Every pair of eyes in that clubhouse turned toward me. The long, rectangular room was packed tighter than usual. Word had spread after the last meeting. The fence lady was coming back. Neighbors filled the back rows, pretending to flip through the agenda handouts while whispering behind cupped hands. Rick sat at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as the chair he'd claimed. His nameplate gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Rick Coleman, HOA President. His smile was polite, rehearsed, the kind you'd wear if you thought you were about to win again. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every sleepless night, every letter, every cruel smirk he'd given me. "I'm here regarding the violation notices on my fence," I said evenly. My voice didn't shake. "And the claims you've made about the boundary line." Rick leaned back, clasping his hands. "Mrs. Miller, as I've already explained—" "No," I cut in, sliding the map across the table until it stopped in front of him. "You didn't explain. You dictated." The paper made a soft slap against the wood, and a few people in the audience shifted in their seats. I pointed at the shaded section, the narrow strip of land behind my fence. "This is Parcel 17B. It's not part of Oak Ridge Estates. It's county-owned property, unclaimed, unsold, and completely outside your jurisdiction." Rick blinked, caught off guard for a fraction of a second before recovering his smirk. "I think you're misinformed," he said smoothly. "That land has always been part of the HOA boundaries. Everyone here knows that." I met his gaze, holding it. "Then you won't mind showing me the recorded plat that says so." I turned toward the board members seated beside him, because according to the county records, the HOA's recorded map ends 20 feet short of my property line. "This parcel," I tapped the paper, hard enough to echo, "was never transferred into your control. Which means you've been fining me for something you don't even have authority over." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members, a balding man named Don, leaned forward, squinting at the map. "Rick," he said cautiously, "is that accurate? I don't remember seeing that parcel listed in the annual filing." Rick's jaw tightened. "We've managed this community for 15 years. I think we know our own boundaries." I almost smiled. "Apparently not." He slammed his hand on the table. The sharp sound startled a few people. "You think you can just waltz in here with a piece of paper and tell me how to do my job?" His voice rose, the calm mask slipping. "You're wasting everyone's time with bad information." "I got this directly from the county recorder's office," I said steady. "Dated, signed, and certified. Would you like to call them and verify it?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The board exchanged uneasy glances. Rick looked down at the map again, his face reddening as he realized I wasn't bluffing. His power, the thing he'd used to control and intimidate, had a crack in it now, and everyone could see it. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, calm and deliberate, the way you do when you finally know you're right. "All I wanted was to be treated fairly," I said softly. "You could have checked this before sending threats and tearing down property. But you didn't. You assumed no one would question you." Rick didn't respond right away. He stared at the map, fingers tapping against the table. Then he looked up and his eyes were colder than before. "You think this changes anything?" he said, voice low and sharp. "You think this is over?" I gathered the papers, sliding them back into my folder. "No," I said, meeting his stare. "I think this is just the beginning." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've just started something you can't finish." The words sank in like ice, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel fear. I felt strength. Rick snarls, "You think this is over? You've just started something you can't finish." I woke up to red spray paint across my fence. One word. Illegal. It was still wet, dripping down the boards in jagged streaks that glistened in the early morning light. The letters were huge, almost chest-high, slashed across the cedar like a scar. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air smelled of chemicals and damp grass, sharp and sour, as though the word itself was burning into the wood. Tom came outside a few seconds later, barefoot and half awake, holding his coffee mug like a lifeline. He froze when he saw it. "What the hell?" he whispered, setting the mug down slowly. We stood there together in silence, the cool morning wind tugging at my hair, both of us trying to make sense of it. The night before had been quiet. No cars, no voices, nothing to hint at what was coming. Yet someone had been on our property, close enough to touch the fence I'd built with my own hands. I called the sheriff's office right away. A deputy arrived within the hour, Deputy Alvarez, according to his badge. He was young, polite, and careful with his words. "It's vandalism," he said, running a finger over the drying paint. "But without witnesses or clear evidence, it's tough to pursue." He looked at the angle of the spray pattern, then back at me. "You got cameras?" "Not yet," I said. "Guess that's next." He nodded, scribbling something on his notepad. "Document everything, photos, times, anything unusual you notice. If this happens again, you'll have a case." When he left, I felt smaller somehow. The house that used to be my safe space now felt exposed. Every window felt like an eye. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like a warning. That night, I lay awake listening for footsteps, headlights, anything. But the only thing I heard was the soft rustle of leaves outside and the occasional bark of a dog down the street. By morning, the whispers had begun. Nancy from next door pretended she didn't notice the paint when she came out to water her flowers, but I saw her glance, quick and guilty. Another neighbor, Pete, crossed to the other side of the street when he saw me sweeping the driveway. They all knew who was behind this. They just didn't want to get involved. Rick had built his authority on fear, and no one dared cross him. At the next HOA newsletter drop, a fresh stack of letters appeared on every doorstep. The headline read, "Non-compliance issue still pending." Beneath it was a paragraph written in Rick's familiar tone. Polite on the surface, venomous underneath, implying that certain homeowners were damaging the community's reputation. He didn't name me, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew. By that afternoon, I had bought 2 motion-activated cameras from the hardware store and mounted them on the corners of my property. Tom wired them to a small monitor in the kitchen. "At least now," he said, "if they come back, we'll know." For the first time, I realized how much this battle had changed me. I was no longer just angry. I was wary, guarded. Every sound outside made me glance toward the window. Every car that slowed near our house set my heart racing. The sense of peace that came with home ownership, the quiet pride I'd felt the day we moved in, had been replaced by something darker. That evening, as the sun went down, I stood in the yard and traced my fingers over the word again. The paint had dried into the grain, staining the cedar permanently. I could paint over it, sure, but I didn't. Not yet. I wanted to remember what this felt like. The violation, the injustice, the quiet rage that came with knowing someone thought they could scare me into submission. Inside, Tom tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe this'll backfire," he said, forcing a smile. "Maybe people will finally see what kind of man Rick really is." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. Men like Rick didn't break that easily. They pushed until something pushed back harder. Over the next 2 days, I documented everything. The letters, the paint, even the slight tire marks in the dirt near the curb. I started keeping a journal, times, dates, every odd noise I heard. I wasn't going to be caught unprepared again. A few nights later, around midnight, I sat up in bed, unable to sleep. The house was mesmerized, silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of the security monitor on the dresser. I stared at the small screen for a while. The live feed from the front yard, the fence line barely visible in the darkness. Then, just after 12:45 a.m., the feed flickered. A pair of headlights slid across the screen, slow and deliberate. I leaned closer. The camera refocused, catching the outline of a truck as it crawled past the front of our house. My stomach dropped. The camera's timestamp read 12:47 a.m. I froze the frame and zoomed in on the plate. Faint, but visible enough to read one thing. Coleman contracting. It was Rick's truck. And now, I had proof. Footage shows Rick's pickup truck driving past our house at 12:47 a.m. While Rick lectured the neighborhood about integrity, I was buying the land under his roses. It was a Saturday morning, the kind of morning that usually smelled like cut grass and barbecues, but instead of trimming hedges like everyone else, I was standing in line at the county recorder's office with a manila folder tucked under my arm and a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. Outside, the sun hit the windows of the courthouse like a spotlight, and for once, I didn't shy away from it. I was done hiding. The waiting area buzzed with low conversation and the soft whir of a printer from somewhere behind the glass partition. The air smelled faintly of dust and toner. I could hear the slow tick of a clock on the wall, counting down to something that felt like justice. Jenna, the same clerk who'd helped me before, recognized me immediately. She smiled, the kind of knowing smile that made me think she already guessed what I was there to do. "Back again, Mrs. Miller?" she asked, motioning me to the counter. "Just following up on that parcel we talked about," I said, sliding the form across the counter. 17B. Jenna's fingers tapped on her keyboard with mechanical precision. "You're serious about purchasing?" "Completely." She looked up, studying my face for a moment, then nodded. "You know, this doesn't happen often. People actually claiming these little border lots. Most don't even realize they exist." "I realized," I said quietly. "And I think someone else is about to realize it too." The printer hummed to life, spitting out a few crisp pages that smelled faintly of ink. Jenna placed them neatly before me. The purchase agreement, the deed transfer request, and the final certification sheet. My hands didn't shake this time as I signed my name in black ink. Each stroke deliberate, each letter steady. I'd never thought paper could feel so heavy with meaning. The process took less than 30 minutes, but it felt monumental. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly as if the whole building was holding its breath. When Jenna finally stamped the last page with a firm thunk, I swear I could hear the sound echo in my chest. "That's it?" I asked, half in disbelief. "That's it," she said, leaning closer, lowering her voice. "Congratulations, Mrs. Miller. You're now the official owner of Parcel 17B. I exhaled a laugh that sounded more like relief than humor. "Feels strange," I said. "Like I just won something no one else even knew was a prize." Jenna smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the quiet victories are the best kind. They make the loud ones possible." I folded the papers carefully, the crisp edges scratching faintly against my fingers. For a moment, I just stood there, looking down at my name next to the parcel number. Sarah Miller, owner. It wasn't a lot of land, barely 4 feet wide and 75 feet long, but it was mine. Mine, and no longer within Rick Coleman's reach. As I walked out of the building, the sunlight felt different, brighter somehow. The courthouse steps creaked beneath my shoes, and I could feel the weight of the envelope in my purse like a weapon I didn't have to draw. I imagined Rick holding one of his HOA meetings, lecturing about community values and respect for authority, completely unaware that the ground beneath his own manicured roses no longer belonged to him. Back home, I spread the documents across the kitchen table like a battle plan. Tom leaned over my shoulder, scanning the survey map. "You're kidding," he said, tracing the boundary line with his finger. "Nope," I said, unable to hide the satisfaction in my voice. "That little gray section, that's all ours now." He looked closer, squinting. "Wait a second, is that—" I nodded, smiling slowly. "Rick's flower bed." Tom laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in weeks. "You bought his flowers?" "Just the dirt underneath," I said. "He can keep the petals." The irony wasn't lost on me. Rick had tried to make me feel powerless, to corner me with fines and threats and false authority. But now, by following the law, his favorite weapon, I had turned it back on him. Every inch of that 4-foot strip was a quiet rebellion, a statement that I wouldn't be intimidated anymore. I looked again at the map, at the line that marked where his world ended and mine began. For weeks that line had been a symbol of fear. Now it was something else entirely. It was freedom. It was proof that power could shift even in the smallest ways, if you were willing to dig deep enough to find the truth. As I folded the map and slipped it back into the envelope, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired, yes, but stronger. The kind of strong that doesn't come from winning easily, but from refusing to quit. The Parcel's survey map reveals part of Rick's flowerbed now lies on Sarah's land. The look on Rick's face when the new post went in was priceless. I had waited almost 2 weeks for the permit to clear and the surveyor to mark the boundaries of my newly purchased parcel. The morning the crew arrived, the sun was already high, and the neighborhood was quiet. The kind of quiet that always comes before something unforgettable. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of fresh lumber stacked neatly by the curb. For once, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. The men I'd hired worked fast, 3 of them, experienced and polite. They unloaded equipment from their truck, the rhythmic clang of metal tools echoing through the cul-de-sac. A power drill whirred to life, slicing through the silence. The sound was sharp, final, like justice being served in wood and steel. I stood on the porch with my arms crossed, the county-approved survey tucked in a folder beside me, just in case anyone asked. By the time the first post went into the ground, I saw him. Rick Coleman, storming across his driveway in that same white polo he always wore. His face already red from fury or sun. Probably both. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the workers measuring along the fence line. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice cutting through the hammering. The foreman, a tall man named Lewis, looked up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Installing a fence, sir," he said plainly. Rick's eyes flicked toward me. "On my property?" I stepped down from the porch, calm and deliberate. "Actually, Rick," I said, holding up the document. "On mine." He blinked, thrown off for a split second before regaining his bluster. "That's HOA land. You can't just start building wherever you please." "County land," I corrected. "Or rather, it was county land. I bought it last week. The deeds recorded and filed." The look that spread across his face was something between disbelief and rage. "You can't... that's..." He stopped, stammering as the realization hit him. The board members, who had been mowing lawns or washing cars nearby, began to gather at the edge of their driveways. Within minutes, half the street was watching. I could hear the faint buzz of whispers, fragments of disbelief floating through the air. "She bought the land? Can she even do that? Oh, Rick's going to lose it." Sawdust hung in the air like mist as the workers continued drilling, ignoring Rick's shouting. Birds scattered from the trees as another post slammed into place. My heart was pounding, but not from fear this time. From something else. Triumph. The kind of triumph that comes after surviving humiliation and fighting your way back on your own terms. Rick marched right up to the fence line, his shoes kicking up dust. "This is trespassing," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You and your husband are breaking the law." Tom appeared in the doorway behind me, his expression firm but calm. "Funny," he said. "I thought the law was on our side now." Rick's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny? You're destroying community property." I held up the stamped deed like a badge. "Community property ends 4 feet that way," I said, nodding toward the faded HOA boundary marker. "You can check the records if you want. Or call the county. They'll tell you the same thing." For a moment, he just stood there, fuming, speechless, his face an alarming shade of crimson. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed back to his house. I exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of adrenaline wash over me. Around us, the neighbors began to drift away, pretending to return to their chores. But I could see the looks on their faces. Curiosity, maybe even a bit of respect. The fence extension continued through the afternoon. Each time the hammer struck wood, I felt something loosen inside me. The knot of fear, the tightness in my chest that had been there for weeks. Every new post wasn't just a piece of lumber, it was a statement. I was reclaiming what was mine, legally and unapologetically. By the time the last section went up, the sun was dipping low, painting everything gold. I thought it was over. The noise, the stairs, the fight. But as I turned toward the house, I saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the fence. 2 police cars had pulled up to the curb. One of the officers stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses. "Ma'am," he called out, "we got a report of trespassing and property damage." I didn't even have to ask who made the call. Rick stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, that smug expression back on his face. But this time, there was something else there too. Desperation. I wiped the sawdust from my hands, picked up the folder with my deed, and walked calmly toward the officers. "Let's clear this up," I said. "I've been waiting for this conversation." Police arrive after Rick calls 911. Again, the envelope looked harmless, until I saw the words Superior Court of County. It was a thick, official-looking packet, stamped and sealed, the kind of document that instantly made your hands go cold. I stood in the doorway, the morning light cutting across the paper like a blade. Tom looked up from the kitchen table, a spoon of cereal frozen halfway to his mouth. "What is it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Rick," I said quietly. "He's suing us." The next hour blurred together. I sat at the table flipping through pages, complaint after complaint, each one more absurd than the last. Trespass, defamation, malicious intent to damage community reputation. The words read like a personal attack disguised as legal jargon. According to Rick's filing, my fence extension had caused irreparable harm to the unity and image of Oak Ridge Estates. He even attached photos of his flower bed, claiming I'd stolen decorative space. Tom paced the kitchen, muttering under his breath, "He's lost it. This is harassment." I wanted to agree, but fear crept in anyway. Legal battles weren't something I understood. Paperwork could bury you faster than any bulldozer. Rick knew that. He'd turned a neighborhood dispute into a court case. And this time, it wasn't just about the fence. It was about power, again. By noon, I was sitting in the office of Michael Dawson, a local attorney recommended by a friend from work. His office smelled faintly of old books and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. He was in his early 40s, sharp-eyed but calm, the kind of man who had seen plenty of messy cases and still believed in logic. After scanning the complaint, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "He's ambitious. I'll give him that," Michael said. "But lawsuits like this fall apart fast if you know where to look." I tried to smile, but the anxiety clung to me like static. "He's accusing me of defamation. For what? For defending myself?" Michael shrugged. "People like him love using intimidation as a weapon. He's banking on the cost of the process scaring you into submission, but..." He flipped to the back of the packet, his finger tracing the small print at the bottom of the page. "He made a mistake." I leaned forward. "What kind of mistake?" He smiled faintly, the way a chess player smiles before taking a queen. "He filed this in the wrong jurisdiction. See here." He tapped the top of the page where it listed Oak Ridge Estates HOA versus Sarah Miller. He filed under HOA authority, not county property law. The parcel in question, your new parcel, isn't governed by the HOA. It's county recorded property. That means this entire claim rests on an area his organization has no legal control over. "So," I asked cautiously, "what does that mean for us?" "It means," Michael said, closing the folder with a soft snap, "that this case is already dead in the water. He doesn't have the standing to sue you for something outside HOA jurisdiction." Relief flooded me so fast I almost laughed. For weeks, I'd been fighting blind, running on emotion and stubbornness. But now, for the first time, I had the law on my side. Cold, written proof that Rick's entire crusade was built on sand. Still, Michael's expression didn't relax entirely. "We'll file a motion to dismiss, but I'd like to dig a little deeper. Something about this doesn't sit right with me." He turned to his computer and began typing quickly, pulling up the HOA's most recent financial filings. "See? Every HOA has to submit annual statements to the county for transparency. Most of them are boring. Lists of dues, maintenance expenses, landscaping fees. But sometimes, his voice trailed off as he scrolled through a spreadsheet. What? I asked. He frowned. There's movement here that doesn't make sense. Several transfers out of the maintenance fund. Small amounts, but regular. And look at this one. $5,000 paid to Coleman Services LLC. I blinked. Wait, Rick's last name is Coleman. Michael nodded slowly. Exactly. Looks like our friend's been paying himself with HOA funds. That's not just unethical, it's criminal if proven. The realization sent a chill through me. Rick hadn't just abused power. He'd profited from it. This wasn't about fences or flowers or bylaws. It was about money. Michael leaned back, folding his arms. If what I'm seeing is accurate, this could flip everything. Not only can we get your case dismissed, we might be able to expose him entirely. For the first time since opening that envelope, I felt something other than fear. It wasn't joy exactly, more like the sharp edge of justice beginning to take shape. Do it, I said. Whatever you have to do, find out everything. Michael nodded, already typing again. Oh, I plan to. And something tells me Rick Coleman has no idea what kind of storm he's just started. Michael discovers suspicious financial transfers from the HOA's maintenance fund. One leaked email from Rick changed everything. It arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning, tucked between grocery coupons and a weather alert. But the moment I opened it, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The subject line read, Invoice adjustments. Urgent. It had been sent accidentally, forwarded by a nervous board member who must have meant to send it to Rick, not my lawyer. Within the first two lines, everything we'd suspected was right there, in black and white. Rick Coleman had been using HOA maintenance funds to pay for personal home upgrades. I called Michael immediately. You need to see this, I said, my voice trembling somewhere between fury and disbelief. Within an hour, I was back in his office, the email printed and highlighted. He read it twice, then leaned back in his chair, whistling softly. He was sloppy, he said. This isn't just bad bookkeeping. This is embezzlement. The email was part of a chain between Rick and a local contractor. The receipts listed community landscape enhancement, but the address tied to the work orders wasn't the park or the pool maintenance shed. It was Rick's home. There were payments for stonework, new fencing, even an outdoor kitchen listed under HOA beautification expenses. Every line item told the same story. He'd been bleeding the neighborhood dry to fund his personal projects. Michael's eyes sharpened as he started printing more documents from the HOA's online portal. This is the kind of thing investigators love, he said. There's a trail. Money always leaves a trail. Over the next few days, he built a case thick enough to fill a binder. Bank transfers, invoices, emails, all neatly labeled and cross-referenced. I helped, however I could, printing, reviewing, reading until my eyes ached. The stress that had once left me shaking now transformed into something else. Focus. I wanted him exposed, not for revenge, but for every neighbor he'd intimidated, every letter he'd sent, every rule he'd twisted to serve himself. By Friday, Michael contacted the County Fraud Investigation Division. They agreed to review the documents immediately. 2 investigators showed up at his office the next morning, both calm and methodical, the kind of people who didn't waste time on small talk. I watched from the corner as they examined the papers, occasionally exchanging quiet glances. When one of them finally looked up, she said the words I'd been hoping to hear. There's enough here to open an inquiry. Those words felt like oxygen. For months I'd been the one under a microscope, the accused, the troublemaker. Now finally, Rick Coleman was the one about to be questioned. By Monday, the news started to spread. No one said it directly, but whispers traveled fast in Oak Ridge Estates. I saw blinds twitch when I walked by, caught glimpses of neighbors huddled in driveways, talking in low voices. Nancy, the neighbor who'd once avoided me, stopped by that evening with a plate of brownies, a suburban olive branch. "We heard about what you found," she said, her voice cautious but supportive. I always thought something was off about him. I thanked her, surprised by how much that small gesture meant. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like an outsider. People were starting to see what I'd seen all along, that Rick's power was an illusion built on fear and fraud. That night, Tom and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the roofs of the houses that had once felt like a cage. "You realize," he said quietly, "you didn't just win your case. You might have taken him down for good." I wanted to believe that, but I'd learned better than to celebrate too soon. Rick had built himself into this community's authority figure for years. Men like that didn't crumble without a fight. Still, the sight of his driveway, empty, his truck gone for the past 2 days, was its own small victory. The next afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID said County Investigator's Office. I answered, my pulse quickening. "Mrs. Miller," the voice said, calm but firm. "This is Investigator Hale. We've reviewed your attorney's evidence, and we'll be holding a hearing regarding the misuse of HOA funds. We'd like you to testify as a witness." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The same woman who once stood helpless in her own yard, watching her fence destroyed, was now being called to stand in front of officials and expose the man who'd started it all. "I'll be there," I said finally. My voice didn't shake this time. It felt steady, certain, because now, this wasn't just my fight. It was justice. Investigators called Sarah to testify at the upcoming hearing. Rick's hands shook when the judge read the audit report aloud. I could see the tremor from where I sat. 2 rows back in the small, wood-paneled courtroom that smelled faintly of old varnish and coffee. The sound of papers rustling echoed through the space as the judge adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice firm, deliberate, the kind of voice that cuts through excuses like a blade. "According to the county's financial audit," he said, glancing up, "Mr. Richard Coleman authorized multiple unauthorized payments from the Oak Ridge Estates Maintenance Fund to a private entity under his own name. Over $18,000 in misused funds have been identified." A low murmur spread across the courtroom. The board members sitting behind Rick exchanged nervous glances. Some looked pale, others looked furious. Tom's hand brushed mine, grounding me as my pulse pounded in my ears. Rick tried to interrupt, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, those payments were reimbursements. I fronted money for community improvements." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "The documentation says otherwise. There were no board votes approving these expenditures. No receipts, no invoices, and no consent from the homeowners whose fees you spent." Rick's face turned red, the veins in his neck visible. He opened his mouth again, but his lawyer leaned over, whispering something that made him go quiet. The silence that followed was suffocating. Across the aisle, Michael sat calm and composed, one hand resting on a thick binder of evidence. I thought about the endless hours we'd spent gathering it. Every receipt, every email, every line of data that proved what Rick had done. For weeks he'd tried to paint me as a nuisance, a liar, a rule breaker. Now, under the harsh courtroom lights, his empire of paperwork and intimidation was finally collapsing. The judge turned his attention to our side. "As for Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone softening slightly, "this court finds no evidence of trespassing, defamation, or malicious intent. The claims filed against her are dismissed with prejudice." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. Tom squeezed my hand, whispering, "It's over." But the judge wasn't finished. He shifted his gaze back to Rick. "Furthermore, this court orders a full financial audit of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Until the results are reviewed, Mr. Coleman, you are hereby suspended from your position as HOA President. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the room. Rick's jaw dropped. "You can't." "I can," the judge interrupted. "And I just did." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. The sound was final, decisive. A sound I would remember for the rest of my life. Rick stood there motionless, as the bailiff approached to escort him out. His lawyer was already packing up papers, avoiding eye contact. The board members behind him whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disgust. As the judge exited, the tension broke. A few homeowners who had attended out of curiosity began clapping quietly, hesitant at first, then louder. I turned to Michael, who allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Told you," he said softly. "These guys always leave a trail." I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was deeper. Relief, exhaustion, something close to peace. For the first time since this began, I could breathe without fear. The weight that had pressed against my chest for months was gone, replaced by something lighter, freer. As I gathered my things, Rick brushed past me on his way out. His cologne was sharp, bitter, and I could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him. He leaned in close, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "This isn't over," he said. His tone wasn't loud, but it was venomous. A promise, not a threat. I didn't flinch. I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "No, Rick, it is." Still, as he walked out of the courtroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely bluffing. As Rick leaves the courtroom, he leans in and says, "This isn't over." For the first time in months, I slept with the windows open. The night air drifted in gently, cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain-soaked soil. For weeks, the house had felt like a bunker, locked up, tense, waiting for the next knock on the door, the next letter, the next confrontation. But now, the silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. It was ours. The morning after the court ruling, I woke to birdsong instead of anxiety. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, striping the floor in warm gold. For a few minutes, I just stood by the window, breathing in the air that no longer tasted like dread. Outside, the new fence stood tall and solid, the cedar catching the light just right, a symbol of every battle we'd fought and won. The neighborhood felt different too, softer. People waved again. Nancy came by that afternoon with a basket of fresh muffins, her eyes a little guilty. "We should have stood up for you sooner," she said. Everyone knew Rick was out of control. We were just scared. I didn't hold it against her. Fear was Rick's greatest weapon. Not rules, not fines, not bylaws. He'd ruled this place with the quiet threat of humiliation. I understood that now. "It's over," I said, smiling faintly. "That's what matters." Over the next few days, other neighbors stopped by. Pete offered to help repaint the sections of the fence that had been spray painted. The Jenkins family, who'd once avoided eye contact, left a small card in our mailbox. "You did the right thing. Thank you." Even the air around Oak Ridge Estates seemed lighter, as if the whole community had exhaled at once. Inside our house, normal life began to return in slow, gentle waves. Tom started playing music in the mornings again, filling the kitchen with old rock songs and the smell of fresh coffee. I returned to my work at the school, where my co-workers had followed the case through whispers and local news updates. When one of them asked how it felt to win, I said the truth. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like breathing again. Every evening, I found myself drawn to the backyard, where the sun dipped behind the fence line and painted the wood in soft amber. The wind moved through the slats, humming low like a whisper of relief. I would run my fingers along the grain, rough in some places, smooth in others, just like the last few months of my life. This fence had once been the source of my fear, then my fight, and finally my freedom. One night, Tom joined me outside with 2 mugs of coffee. "Hard to believe it's over," he said. "No letters, no meetings, no shouting. It's strange," I said quietly, looking up at the sky streaked in orange and lavender. "I almost forgot what peace sounds like." He smiled, reaching for my hand. "Feels like we earned it." We sat there in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed, a sound that used to feel distant, but now felt like life returning. Still, There were moments I caught myself glancing at Rick's house. It was dark most nights, his driveway empty. I didn't know if he'd moved out or was just keeping to himself, but either way, I didn't care. His power here was gone, stripped by truth, exposed by law. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail, this one without a seal of threat or accusation. It was from the County Land Division. I tore it open at the kitchen counter, expecting routine paperwork, but the letter inside made me pause. Mrs. Miller, it began, as the current owner of Parcel 17B and adjoining Lot 42, the county offers you the option to merge both properties under one permanent title. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The two parcels, the original home and the narrow strip I'd fought so hard for, could now officially become one. No more boundaries to dispute, no more gray lines for anyone to manipulate. I smiled as I folded the letter. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all this time spent fighting over boundaries, I was finally being asked to erase one. County sends Sarah an offer to merge the parcels under one title, permanently. In the end, that fence didn't divide us. It defined who had the right to stand their ground. For months, it was nothing more than wood and nails. A line in the dirt that seemed to separate good neighbors from bad, fairness from arrogance, right from wrong. But now, when I looked at it, I didn't see conflict anymore. I saw courage, the quiet kind that doesn't roar but refuses to move. I learned that power isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's found in persistence, in refusing to bow down when someone misuses authority to keep others afraid. Rick Coleman thought his title made him untouchable. He thought rules could bend to his will, that people like me would never question him. But laws, real laws, don't serve egos, they serve truth. There's a kind of peace that only comes after chaos, when the storm clears and you're still standing. That's what this fence became for me. Proof that no matter how small you feel, the moment you decide to fight back, you stop being powerless. And you don't need a lawyer or a badge or a title to do it. Just the courage to say, show me the law. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone watching this, it's this. Always verify your HOA's authority. Don't take their word as gospel. Every rule, every fine, every threat must trace back to something real. A county record, a legal document, a recorded boundary. Because sometimes, the difference between being bullied and being free lies in one piece of paper sitting in a forgotten file drawer. Looking back, I'm proud. Not because I won, but because I didn't let fear dictate my choices. The neighbors who once avoided me now stop by just to say hi. The air feels lighter, the street quieter, and that fence, that once illegal fence, still stands, stronger than ever. But just when I thought it was truly over, life decided to remind me that some battles echo longer than you expect. A week after the county merger papers were finalized, an envelope showed up in the mail. No return address, just a postcard from a nearby town. The message was short, 5 words, written in neat, slanted handwriting. Guess who's back in business? If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it could bully you into silence, this story's for you. What would you have done if your own neighbor turned your home into a battlefield? Tell me your thoughts below. I read every single comment. If you believe no homeowner should be afraid to stand their ground, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs the courage to fight back. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter in this war with Rick Coleman is just getting started. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.